In this session, we discuss engaging with intercultural, interracial, interfaith, intimate partnerships, focusing on systems, strengths, and critical processes across the life cycle. Welcome to the AFTA podcast. I am Naveed Zamani and I am your host. In this session, I'll be speaking with Dr. Gita Seshadri and Dr. Dumayi Gutierrez. Dr. Gita Seshadri is an associate professor in the Couple and Family Therapy program at Alliant International University, Sacramento, California, and online. She currently serves as the branch director at the Sacramento campus. Her research, publications, and presentations focus on interracial, intercultural, interreligious secular couples, and families, diversity, intersectionality constructs, qualitative research, gender perspectives of power within culture, grief, anger management, relapse prevention, and sexuality. She works with diverse clinical populations and maintains a private practice. Her integrative approach focuses on support and empowerment through the lens of postmodern and modern theories. Dr. Dumayi Gutierrez is an assistant professor in the Couple and Family Therapy program at Alliant International University, San Diego, California, and online. Dr. Gutierrez is devoted to working with marginalized communities. She has published and presented nationally on minority stress, intersectionality constructs of self and family systems, couple support systems, resiliencies of sexually marginalized and gender-expansive Latinx populations, intersectional, culturally competent care, and women of color in higher education. She uses a narrative, experiential, and feminist approach incorporating techniques of advocacy and empowerment. In addition, Dr. Gutierrez has served as clinical coordinator and family therapist for the LGBTQ Counseling Clinic in Iowa and the Gender and Family Project at the Ackerman Institute for the Family in New York City. Gita, thank you so much for joining us. And Dumayi, it's great to have you back. What's been capturing your attention in your work these days?
Thank you so much, Naveed, for having us. At the forefront of our minds is the recent book that we published titled Interracial, Intercultural, and Interfaith Couples and Families Across the Life Cycle, A Clinician's Guide. In it is basically what I and Dumayi call our baby, or my baby, actually, I should say, is because it stemmed out of my dissertation. It was, thank you. It was about focusing on strengths with interracial and intercultural couples. What I found, and I actually did a article through Journal of Marriage and Family Therapy after publishing the dissertation to highlight the different couple processes that they have and the different strategies that they use to manage their cultural, racial dynamics. And then what I was feeling is that in order to serve the populations even more, we needed to include a interreligious component or interfaith component. Faith encompasses for us religion and spirituality, if at all it applies, and that's also something to be negotiated. And unfortunately, there has been a lot of negative perception of interracial, intercultural, interfaith. The main issue with it is people believe that there's tons of problems. And what we sort of categorized it, I don't want to say categorized it, what we've sort of directed it into is how couples manage differences. And so in life, a lot of times in a social constructionist lens, we get instructions from culture on how to do things. And when one culture doesn't tell you to do the same thing as another culture, or it's the exact opposite, what do? Right? And then there are also intersections that we have throughout our life cycle when we are specifically attracted to other people in terms of our relationships. How we date, how we get married, how we have kids, how we live together. We went on to even include how we manage illness, how we manage retirement, and how we manage family through culture, race, and religion, because that also could be points of contention. Because when we are from similar backgrounds, it's more of a expected or assumed of this is how we do things type way of doing things. We also talk about ways it manifests in terms of sex. The hot topics are sex, politics, and religion, right? And so there can be, especially in today's society, deep conflict around those things, and divisive conflict around those things. And so our goal is to help not only therapists navigate these conversations because they have to have these conversations, but also the couple and families themselves having these conversations. Because really the thing is it's not the couple or family that's having the problems. It's more of how they have conversations or lack thereof that makes a difference. Is there anything you wanted to add, Dumayi?
Yeah, I completely agree with how you gave. I mean, I think you gave a great synopsis of how we really try to understand the experiences of these relationships from this ecological systems lens, and throughout that lifespan, which is why we called the book interracial, intercultural, interfaith couples and their experiences throughout the lifespan. That's not the exact title, but more so getting to see that if we're working with intersectional ecological systems, it's not just going to be at one stage in their relational development. It's going to include their own cultural and sexual gender identity development. And then that's going to go into how they grow together now within their relationships. And then it's going to impact and they're going to navigate and develop throughout each of these life cycles, for however long they're together. And so that is, I think, so unique and innovative about our book, and that we also share our own case examples throughout each chapter to give that applicability of this is where these experiences have come from. This is how we see different forms of systems of identity development and how we are, what stood out to us just as clinicians working within working with these relationships. And then at the end of each chapter, we also have a visual framework and questions helping clinicians also utilize these visuals and questions with the clients that they're working with. So it creates this parallel engagement process of recognizing the systems they're part of as a therapist, and then the systems that the clients are part of, and they're all intersectional as well. So that include an intersectionality lens throughout the chapters as well to help clinicians and then the clients understand that all of their navigation is very nuanced, that it's not just like a linear process. So yeah, that's what I would add, but it was really fun to write. Exhausting, but fun.
So true. One more thing to also include is our second chapter is about self of the therapist. A lot of times there's no time in graduate programs to really hone in on how my stuff, meaning us as therapists, are triggered. And there's a lot of assumptions around, oh yeah, I'm culturally competent, culturally humble, et cetera, et cetera. And rather than viewing it as an ongoing process, it's more of like a check the box, so to speak, just because of time. And so we've really tried to use the ecological systems model within social constructionism to help therapists really look at themselves and what they've been shaped by. Because, I mean, there's a reason why we all go into this field, right? And so part of it is looking at what we bring to the table and how that is showing up with clients. And so forth. And it isn't just for beginning therapists, it's also for seasoned therapists as well, because we're also human beings as well.
Thank you both so much for sharing about the book, and congratulations again, both Gita on getting your dissertation out to a more wider visible audience, and for the collaborations you're doing. And the way that I'm hearing some of the work you're situating, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're highlighting and celebrating the challenges and difference that kind of come up in interracial, interfaith, intercultural marriages or relationships, excuse me. It seems like the book is also attending to those topics through practice and pedagogy. You're bringing in case examples. You're putting forward some of the ways that training context might support this work. And I'm in San Diego, so I have a pretty skewed perspective, but it feels important too, because I don't know that many couples that aren't interracial these days, or intercultural or interfaith. I feel like I probably occupy a couple of those categories myself. I guess I wonder let me ask this, Gita, and if you don't like this question, I'm happy to ask a different one. But I'm mindful that you said you had this was your dissertation topic first, and then it became this book. So I'm assuming that you have spent quite a long time with these ideas. And you also brought Dumayi into the fold as you were working with these ideas. How did your ideas change or transform from when you started this project to like the conclusion, well, today, post conclusion of the book and talking about it here on this podcast?
Sure. No, it's a good question, I think, is what I sort of thought about. Initially, I know it's a long trajectory in terms of time, right? But I was trying to figure out how I wanted to make a place for this particular population, because I also identify as being a part of this population too. And it was frustrating for me to hear the negative, if you will, story around it. And so I wanted to really figure out, how do people make it work, And then it started with my dissertation in terms of like strategies. And then I'm also, as a therapist, really interested in couple processes. Right. And so that's how initially the processes of coexisting, singularly assimilated and integrated and unresolved came about. So those are those processes of what happens within a couple around culture and race. Right. And then what also felt really like an added component, which is why I created or push forward with Dumayi this book, is around addressing addressing more dynamics like context of faith, as well as how does this manifest long term, right? Because and even in our research, we found little research past marriage. Like I think this ended up in the book about when someone's planning a wedding. There were 2 books on interracial, intercultural marriage and how to make that work. And it was more of, I believe, a lot of the melding was of Christian and Jewish culture. And there's nothing wrong with that. And also, what do we do when there's also a minority partner? Because the interracial dynamics change when someone is darker skin tone than the other, right? Because we walk on the street and there's a different reaction and assumption that happens.
And this is perhaps a racialized piece of the work?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then I also felt like it was important to include the sexuality piece, as well, because relationships aren't just heterosexual, right? And how do we navigate additional identities is also really important.
Thanks for sharing that. I'm leaving a little bit of space. Dumayi, you can hop in whenever. Um, I want to ask another question, but I did want to check in with you, Dumayi, if you wanted to add anything to that.
I think, well, in speaking to bringing me in, I think this is where Gita and I were really able to integrate and enhance our work together. And like I learned, and we both learned so much in the time that we were writing and researching this book. And so, for my perspective, to really bring in that intersectionality piece and hone in on sexuality, gender, and culture, and so then being able to even see what that looks like in different forms of stages for these relationships and these couples was really interesting, and kind of going back to what Gita was saying of how little there was regarding some aspects and how much there was around like sex and power in particular. Even just looking up what does sexuality look like in intercultural relationships, one of the first things was always talking about just sex and having sex and who has power. And if a white man is with a woman of color, then exoticism, what role does exoticism play? And you really wouldn't find much else. And I really had to do like a deep dive into moving away from stereotyping and just leaning into just talking about black and white dynamics. And that's where intersectionality frameworks really helped to understand those different nuances of identity within these relationships. So that's what I would add, but it really was interesting, the enhancing of our work.
Yeah, I'm appreciating how you're describing that, Dumayi. Let me know if it's a fair capture that even in the writing of this book, your own social locations colored various corridors of the ideas in the work. And Gita, as you were describing like planning a wedding, I kind of had a smile on my face because that was such a point of contention in my own. It wasn't not contention is not the right word, but it was it required a lot of thoughtfulness in my own relationship. So yeah, I am in a heterosexual monogamous relationship. My wife is white American and Mexican, and I'm Iranian American. And so for our wedding, it was like, how do we make everyone happy while still honoring what we want? Which ended up in like kind of three weddings almost. I mean, not like full weddings, but we had like the Persian wedding, which is called an act, the night before our wedding. So that was like honoring my parents, and that was important to them. Then we had like Saturday, which was our wedding, me and my wife, and then Sunday was the Catholic wedding ceremony. So we went to the church, and it was so interesting the whole way because my wife had to do some Muslim type stuff because my family's Muslim, so she had to sit with a kind of a religious leader in our community and do some stuff. And then I had to sign some weird forms at the Catholic Church that I won't get into here, but they were a little bizarre, very bureaucratic. But the whole way it did feel like lots of expressions of love and interest in each other. So yeah, I'm just kind of like in my own memories and thoughts. I wonder if I could ask you a question, Gita, just for my own understanding, because you spoke to like certain processes that I don't know if I heard you right. You were talking about these processes like coexisting, and you had named a couple other terms and its relation to your work. I wonder if you could say more about that. I wasn't familiar with those terms and I wanted to learn more.
Sure. And the heart of it is in that article that I published with Journal of Marriage and Family Therapy. So if listeners would like to look that up, that's always available. And I can send you that title too as well if you need it.
Do you mind stating the title, Gita, if you remember?
Sure.
Or you can do it at the end. Oh, yeah.
how do interracial and intercultural couples manage their, wait, maybe I should say it at the end because can't remember the exact title because it's been a while. But it's basically what works in managing interracial and intercultural dynamics. So what was found in that study was there were three ways, or four ways, I should say, that couples organized around race and culture. And the way that race was defined is the visual distinctions, right? And then the cultural distinctions was how they were raised with traditions and customs and expectations. And so integrated was you can totally see how two cultures were intermixed. Coexisting is that there's two separate cultures and they participate separately in their cultures. And then singularly assimilated is where one person takes on the other person's culture and their culture primarily disappears. And then unresolved is where it creates a lot of conflict and they don't know what to do with those differences. And so, and in that article, they also, we also talked about ways to help a couple figure out what their process style is, and how to help the clinician help the couple move towards the process that they want or what they were familiar with, again, within the ecological systems model.
Okay, great. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for explaining that. And as you're going through, I was kind of imagining various contexts that I've come into contact with.
Sure. And I will say that the book is more focused on the life cycle and ecological systems portion of it. I know that Dumayi and I are talking about doing another article about looking at how those processes are going to be looked at within each stage of the life cycle.
Ooh, there's so much to ask about. And I guess I just want to ask, I guess, what were some things that you came to know and understand through this journey together? What are some practices that you came across that maybe you were surprised by or you found helpful in your own practice? Because I know you both hold a practice at the moment, but things that have felt kind of reliable and helpful as you're engaging with couples in these contexts.
I'll say, I think being able to, so of course, in our training for couple and family therapists, we're trained from a systems lens. So we know when we're working with relationships that are, that they're impacted by these various constructs and experiences from their family, their history, intergenerational patterns, and then the community and I think overall policies that are passed. But I think doing this book and going through each life cycle, specifically utilizing intersectionality and ecological systems, it really gave me more of a concrete idea of rather than not that I would stay in one particular systematic level, but to be able to ensure that I'm going through all of the levels, and that if I'm feeling stuck, what I found is that if I'm feeling kind of stuck with one of my couples, one of the relationships I've been working with, then I'm able to go back to say, what levels have I gone through, and do I need to explore? Say like the chrono system, it's like the overall like temporal changes and psychological processes that may have been impacting the relationship that we haven't really gotten into. So even like COVID, for example, even though COVID the world shut down in 2020, and essentially we're not experiencing in the depth or in the trenches of that pandemic, there is still, it's like, what are they called? Aftershocks from an earthquake.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's still essentially these aftershocks from COVID. And And being able to, I think, go to that level of, okay, so I know we've been talking about communication, attachment, relationship quality, bringing out emotion, doing that together, and identity development within your relationship. But we're still within the same cycle. You're still experiencing the same process. And so then I've been able to go back and say, okay, wait, what kind of aftershocks are impacting your relationship? And that's been from some lack or broken trust during isolation and how they had to navigate their lives, being confined together when they hadn't even lived together. And so it was healing and rebuilding that trust, to potentially grieving lost chosen family members, or other forms of safe spaces. And that was having like a pretty impactful process on their relationship and their growth, that they weren't able to have anyone else to go to anymore, and they haven't been able to rebuild a community. So those are just some examples of, once I'm able to go to a different system that haven't been that we haven't processed yet, then it just gives so much more narrative and information that we're able to move forward from the place that we are stuck at. And then I think about my own system, like, is there anything that's happening for me in my overall systems that's impacting what I'm seeing with my relationships? So that's how it's come in.
And just to clarify, when you're referring to system, you're referring to like the ecological systems that people are in, like the layers?
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The different layers of the ecological system.
Right. Yeah. So it's like, I'm thinking about this idea from, at least I read it with Cejudo, which is the personal is political is cultural. And so as you're kind of encountering couples, you're finding yourself, and if you're encountering couples and you find yourself in some stuckness, the ideas that you and Gita have offered in your book offer some curiosities and questions and maybe some unexamined territories of their life that might be worth making visible. Like, I don't know, I feel like as you're talking, Dumayi, if this tracks, that somebody asking about me and my partner about the aftershocks of COVID. I don't know that we've ever talked about that together, and yet it's something we've experienced together. So I don't even know what you would say. So it is kind of fascinating to think about, like, these really interesting curiosity-driven questions that could really open up some stories that otherwise maybe were not visible or inaccessible, if that's a fair capture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's like, I think our book, and even the own experience that we had writing it, has provided just more of a roadmap and a guide of where to go. And all of there is so much nuance. And of course, we're not able to get to absolutely everything, but the more we can get to, the more we can learn and help our clients heal. And learn more about ourselves too. And something I'll share, I'm also an intercultural marriage, and my wife is white and more androgynous presenting, and we're also gay. We both identify as lesbian, and so that's how we navigate our world too. We have two multi-ethnic daughters who we're also navigating being parents, and Naveed, you have your two kids too. So we're all we're in this together.
Yeah. Well, thanks. And Gita, I see you. Well, folks on listening can't see, but you have been nodding your head vigorously as Dumayi was sharing. I wanted to check in with you and see what's coming up for you as you listen to Dumayi share.
So I resonate a lot with what she shared, and also really thinking about, I think what shifted for me even more so is recognizing that it's not always all about content, right? Like sometimes we're talking about something and it's the history behind it is what is making it so charged, if you will. And so I think really recognizing that and figuring out the meaning behind it can help a lot of the time. And creating a framework for people to talk about it, because and I really appreciate, Naveed, you talked about not even having specific conversations, right? Because we don't think to have specific conversations about like things that we think are just like normal or like in passing, right? And when we start talking about it, we realize the meaning of it and so forth. And I also am in an interracial, intercultural, interfaith relationship as well. And so constant conversations with him as well.
Yeah, as you were sharing, I was remembering a context where some students had hit me up to ask me some questions for their own little class research project. And I remember they positioned me in they said it's for a couples counseling class. I want to speak to you and your partner. And so we got on Zoom and they're like, hi, so we want to ask you about you and your partner's interracial relationship. And I remember kind of turning to her and be like, oh, are we interracial? And so it's kind of like this funny term that I hadn't even considered that I am participating in. And still, I don't even know because the term race is also like, we don't need to go down the philosophical track of how it's socially constructed. But yeah, it was just interesting to consider that, like you're saying, specific conversations that, oh, we are managing some stuff that perhaps we haven't thought more carefully about or maybe more closely about. So if I could ask a question here, I'm not sure who your intended audience was beyond MFTs more generally, or like just couples counselors more generally, if that's right. So I'm kind of assuming that like, if it's fair to assume that anyone who's working with couples could consider these ideas. What are some things, I mean, as we're kind of like wrapping up here, like what are some things that feels like people should probably be considering or knowing? I mean, obviously, besides everyone should read your book because you're probably encountering couples that are fit the context you're describing. But for the sake of conversation in this podcast, like what are some things that people should be really careful about or considering or keen to as they're starting this work?
I would say don't assume that you know it. There can be unintended harm, right? With assuming that, oh, yes, I'm culturally competent, or I'll just have the client tell me about their culture, right? Or what are my assumptions about culture as well? I would say start there. And also, don't expect it to be a learning process as well, is kind of what sort of coming up for me as I'm hearing your question. I also would say, going back to what you were saying earlier, Naveed, is that this book is for any type of mental health professional. And also, we have written it in a way that is very relatable. And so for clients, they can also pick it up and see how they relate to the stories as well. And so I would encourage that as well, or people who've had previous relationships that fall in these categories and want more self-understanding around it.
Well, I love to think about it as a resource for clients too. That's exciting. Thanks, Gita. What about you, Dumayi?
Yeah, I would agree all of what Gita was saying. And I think coming in with the mindset that just as you go through your counseling or therapeutic training, that you're learning not only content of how to do therapy, but you also do such a deep dive into who you are and all of your relationships, your patterns, your history, and how that impacts you as a therapist. And that is essentially what you do with this book too, that you're learning how to work with couples and relationships through that intersectional ecological systems lens, but simultaneously, you're also learning even more about yourself. as you are going through that lens. And so it's, I think of it as a journey and a growth experience for you as a reader and ultimately the people that you're helping too. Yeah, it'll be a good journey.
Would it be okay if I asked a bit of a downer question? I just want to acknowledge, like, the kind of the interesting thing about my experience with these podcasts too, is that they become a bit of an archival thing, right? Where like we're having this conversation right now at the end of January in 2025. There's a new administration. Um, a lot of my work too, Gita, I'm not sure if you know, but I work with Middle Eastern refugees and immigrants who are experiencing domestic violence. And so we do a lot of family therapy, couples therapy, and individual counseling as well. So we're starting to, I'll speak for myself, like starting to think about how to also not just help clients, but also protect clients. And like for us, I'm not tracking like the documentation status of clients or putting that into any of my notes. I wonder how your work, the color of it has shifted or expanded, or yeah, how you're kind of thinking about your work now in this kind of contemporary political moment that we're in.
I'll say that it is more important now than ever, and that how it seems, at least for me, this has been my experience, that so my entire CV, you know, put my name in Google, everything is about LGBTQ, social justice, you know, women of color. So in what's the word? Implicitly, it's that's the work that I do. That's the communities that I serve. But when it comes to advocating and making it clear that my work is not going anywhere and that I'm going to continue to advocate and provide a safe space for these communities and multiply diverse communities, is that I'm making that more explicit. So I'm starting my classes saying, this is who I am and this is the work I do. And I'm going to continue doing this work. Or I'm seeing clients and I say, this is who I am and this is the work I do, and we're going to continue to work together. And I'll use my power in whichever way I can to continue to protect and advocate for who you are, and our communities. And so really, I've been finding that whichever spaces I'm in, I'm just being more and more explicit of the work that I do. So it's no longer just you see my CV or even you see my name. Yeah, I could know about culture and these intersections of identity, but the more explicit I can be, I think the stronger. I don't know what I want to say there, but the more explicit I am, the better.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, Dumayi.
Mm-hmm.
What about for you, Gita?
I agree. I think that, and I know we put a line or two about this in terms of the book, even though I wish it was all encompassing, we didn't really deal with that part of the process in terms of immigration and so forth, but it's very relevant to the populations as well. And I would say one, sensitivity, extra sensitivity around that and how that's negotiated, managed, and so forth, as well as I think more and more we need to not to sound egoistic or what have you, but I think it forces us to become more leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And create conversations around how to appropriately talk about this, and make space for people, regardless of what their opinions are. Because if we ignore one side of it, we are not bringing everybody to the table, so to speak.
Yeah. So something about how it is that you're maintaining an open, inclusive stance. You're maintaining your social justice proclivities in the spaces that you're in, keeping the thrust of your work forward and strong, as you said, Dumayi. Um, Yeah, and I just want to honor too that, historical authoritarian and fascist revolutions have not been terribly kind to professors and academics, and that you're finding yourself necessarily positioned as leaders in the ideas that are kind of coming under attack, if that's a fair capture. Um, yeah, so it's TBD on a lot of stuff. I'll be interested to listen back to this podcast in a couple of years because, uh, just as an example, I had a training through a federal grant this past week about some of the work I do, and they went through and they edited out the words culture and justice and the word diverse, not even diversity. Like I was referring to like diverse, I forget what it was, but just like the adjective diverse. And so it's kind of a telling signal because I've only experienced that in Iran, where they go through and edit stuff and make it Islamic. So it does feel like we've passed a critical threshold in the U.S. in terms of free speech. Um, so yeah, wanting to like honor that your work is coming in at a pretty critical time, and that just the title of your book kind of pushes against some of the administration's efforts, which I wish for your safety, and I'm also thankful that you're out there talking about this stuff and making it, like you said, Dumaji, explicit and visible when there's forces pushing against it. Yeah, Dumaji, please, you're gonna say something.
I don't know. I was like, exactly. Like in the fort, I think, you know, I think as hard and what you're saying, having to go through and go be forced into these roles and holding this form of power and responsibility um, can be heavy. And but I think just the passion and the need just feels worth it. Like the balance is there when it comes to taking that leadership role. So I think that's the last thing I wanted to say, that for anyone listening to, if it's feeling exhausting, that it's worth it.
Yeah. Useful anger. Channel your energy into some of the work.
Exactly. Type vigorously.
Yeah, seriously. Well, thank you so much, Dumaji. It was so good to be with you again. And Gita, you had mentioned an article earlier that you were going to remind us the name of for folks who want to look it up. Do you mind saying the name?
Absolutely. So it's called How Couples Manage Interracial and Intercultural Differences, Implications for Clinical Practice. And it was in the 2013 issue of Journal of Family Therapy.
Fantastic. All right. So you've been on these ideas for some time. That's great to hear. Great. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. It was great to hear your ideas and just be with you. Wanting to support you and keep doing your good work. And to listeners, a lot of articles from these two and this fantastic book that is available through the AFTA Spring of Brief series, and for AFTA members is available online. Yeah, so encouraging folks to go out and look it up and get the book. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.